The 6 psychological stages a narcissist goes through when they lose you. And I want to be clear about something before we go a single step further. Because the word stages implies a neat, linear, orderly progression that moves in one direction at a predictable pace. And almost nothing about a narcissist's psychology is neat, linear, orderly, or predictable. So when I say stages, what I actually mean is a sequence of internal experiences that the narcissist moves through, sometimes rapidly, sometimes over months, and sometimes cycling back to earlier ones without warning. They might even run 2 or 3 of them simultaneously in a way that looks like chaos from the outside, but has its own internal logic once you understand what's driving it. Understanding what's driving it and understanding the psychological machinery underneath the behavior you've probably already witnessed or are currently watching from a careful distance is exactly what this episode is designed to give you. Because here's what most content about narcissists losing people gets wrong. It focuses almost entirely on the behavior, what they do, how they act, what the hoovering looks like, what the smear campaign sounds like, and what the replacement relationship is designed to communicate. But behavior is just the surface. Underneath the behavior is a psychology that is far more specific, far more fragile, and far more revealing than most people ever get close enough to understand. By the end of this episode, you are going to understand it completely. So let's begin. Stage 1 is the one that catches almost everyone off guard because it is not what people expect the first stage to be. People expect rage. People expect immediate retaliation, immediate smear campaigns, and immediate replacement. Sometimes those things do come, but almost never first. What comes first in the immediate aftermath of losing someone, particularly someone who is a significant source of supply, someone whose presence, attention, and emotional investment genuinely sustained the narcissist's sense of self in ways they were never fully conscious of, is something that looks from the outside almost exactly like indifference. A cool, composed, almost eerie calm. The narcissist goes about their life. They post on social media with a casualness that seems impossible given what just happened. They mention the ending to mutual friends without any visible distress. They do not appear to be falling apart in any of the ways you might expect someone to fall apart when a significant relationship ends. If you are the person who left, watching this from whatever distance you've managed to create, this apparent indifference lands like a confirmation of every worst fear you carried throughout the relationship. You feel like you never really mattered, like the connection was never real, and that you were replaceable before you even walked out the door. But here is what is actually happening underneath that indifference. And this is the part that changes everything. What looks like calm is not calm. What looks like indifference is not indifference. What you are actually watching is a narcissist's defense system activating at full capacity in response to a threat it was not fully prepared for. That defense system is called devaluation. In this first stage, it is being deployed not against you, not yet, but internally against the significance of what just happened. The narcissist is not processing the loss. They are actively refusing the loss. They are in real time reconstructing their internal narrative around the ending in a way that strips it of its weight. They strip you of your significance within that story. It reduces the relationship to something that was never as important as it appeared from the inside. At least not to them, and at least not in the version they are rapidly assembling to protect themselves from having to feel what it would actually cost them to feel this fully. This is not a conscious process. This is not the narcissist sitting somewhere deciding to perform indifference as a strategy, though it will later become strategic. In this first stage, it is purely defensive. It is a psychological immune system responding to potential devastation with the only tool it has ever reliably had access to, which is the ability to make something feel like it matters less than it does. Stage 2 arrives when the devaluation stops being enough. It stops being enough at the exact moment reality begins penetrating the narrative the narcissist constructed in stage 1. This penetration usually comes from the outside, stemming from the absence of the things you provided that they didn't fully register as supply while you were providing them. It is not the obvious supply, like the admiration, the attention, and the emotional investment that the narcissist consciously enjoyed and consciously sought. It is the subtle supply. It is the way you laughed at something they said, the specific quality of your attention when they were talking, or the fact that you knew their coffee order, their triggers, their history, and the particular way they needed to be handled in certain moods. It is the intimate, detailed, and irreplaceable knowledge that builds up in a long relationship and quietly structures a person's daily experience in ways they never consciously catalog until it's gone. When that starts being absent, when the shape of the days without you starts revealing all the places you used to occupy that the devaluation narrative conveniently forgot to account for, stage 2 begins. Stage 2 is panic. It is almost never expressed panic because the narcissist's relationship with vulnerability is far too compromised for that. It is an internal panic, a sudden and disorienting awareness that the thing they dismissed as manageable is not, in fact, entirely manageable. They realize the supply gap is real and that the loss has dimensions they did not anticipate when they were constructing the indifference of stage 1. This is where the hoovering impulse is born, though it may not be acted on immediately. The narcissist starts tracking you more closely than their indifference performance would suggest. They check your social media with a frequency that contradicts everything they told themselves and everyone else about not caring. They ask mutual friends questions that are framed casually, but are actually designed to gather specific intelligence. They want to know if you are okay, if you are moving on, if you are with someone, or if you seem like you are doing better or worse. They are not doing this out of love. They are doing this from the same impulse that drives someone to keep checking a physical wound, not to heal it, but to assess its depth and to understand how seriously they should be taking what has happened to them. What they discover in this monitoring, more often than not, is information that triggers stage 3 immediately and without warning. Stage 3 is rage. This rage is different from the ordinary anger most people experience during relationship endings. It is different in its quality, different in its targets, and different in its specific psychological function. This is not the rage of heartbreak or the rage of grief looking for somewhere to land. This is narcissistic injury expressed as aggression, and it is directed outward with a precision and an energy that reveals exactly how destabilized the narcissist actually is underneath everything they have been performing since stage 1. The smear campaign that starts in this stage is not random and it is not disorganized. It targets the specific things about you that the narcissist knows from years of intimate knowledge will be most vulnerable to attack. They target your reputation with mutual friends, your credibility in shared spaces, and the private things you trusted them with that can now be reframed, taken out of context, and weaponized. They use this to build a narrative where they are the reasonable one and you are the problem that the relationship couldn't survive. This is the stage that the people who loved you during the relationship find most confusing, because the person they are watching construct this narrative is using information and access that only exists because you trusted them. The intimacy of the relationship is being converted directly into ammunition for its destruction. The cruelty of that conversion is not incidental. It is the entire point, because the rage of stage 3 is not primarily about punishing you. It is about restoring the narrative control that your departure threatened. You leaving, especially if you left with clarity and composure, told a story about who was the problem in that relationship. Stage 3 is the narcissist's attempt to rewrite that story before it solidifies in the minds of everyone watching. But here is what makes stage 3 so psychologically revealing and what plants the seed for everything that comes after it. The rage is disproportionate. It is almost always visibly, uncomfortably disproportionate to the circumstances. And the people watching it, even the people the narcissist is performing it for, even the ones being recruited into the smear campaign, register that disproportionality on some level, even when they do not name it. Because proportionate anger looks like someone processing a painful ending. Disproportionate rage looks like someone who has been genuinely destabilized. A narcissist who is genuinely destabilized is a narcissist who cared more than they were supposed to, lost more than they planned to, and is now burning everything in the vicinity to cover the evidence of how much this has actually cost them. Which means the rage of stage 3, as damaging as it can be to the people on its receiving end, is also the most honest communication the narcissist has produced since the relationship ended. What it is communicating underneath all of the noise, the cruelty, and the narrative warfare is something they would never say out loud in any other form. It is communicating that you mattered, that this loss has weight, and that the performance of stage 1 was exactly what it appeared to be to anyone looking closely enough: a performance. Now we look at what comes after the rage burns itself out, and what the narcissist finds waiting for them when the noise settles. We will examine why stages 4, 5, and 6 are the ones that actually explain why some people never fully escape this dynamic, even long after they should have. That is the part of this story that we are going to go into next. What comes after the rage burns itself out is a silence that feels different from the silence of stage 1. The stage 1 silence was constructed and deliberately assembled as a performance of not caring, engineered to protect the narcissist from having to feel the full weight of what had happened. The silence after stage 3 is different because it is not constructed at all. It is what remains when the energy required to sustain the rage finally runs out, and there is nothing left to replace it with. There is no next move immediately available. There is no narrative to build, no supply source to redirect toward, and no performance left in the tank. What remains in that silence is stage 4. Stage 4 is the one that nobody who has ever watched a narcissist from the outside would ever guess was happening, because it looks nothing like what it actually is. From the outside, it looks like the narcissist has finally moved on. It looks like they have finally settled into the new life they built so visibly and so aggressively in the earlier stages. It appears as though they have finally stopped caring, if they ever really started. But from the inside, in the private experience of the narcissist, during the quiet moments, they are still working very hard to avoid. Stage 4 is the closest thing to genuine grief that a narcissist's psychology is capable of producing. It is nothing like the grief most people know, because it is a grief that cannot be named as grief. It cannot be expressed as grief. It cannot be processed through any of the channels that grief normally moves through, because To name it grief would be to admit that something was lost. To admit that something was lost would be to admit that something mattered. The entire architecture of the narcissist's self-protection is built on the foundational claim that nothing and no one matters more than they choose to let matter. So the grief sits there, unnamed and unmoving, inside a psychology that has no room for it and no tools to work with it. It produces a heaviness that the narcissist experiences as irritability, as restlessness, and as a low-grade dissatisfaction with everything in their current life. They cannot trace it back to its actual source because tracing it back would require an honesty they are not structurally capable of achieving. This is the stage where the replacement relationship, if one was acquired in the earlier stages, starts showing its limitations most clearly. The new person was selected for their ability to produce supply, for their availability, for their admiration, and for their willingness to occupy the role that became vacant when you left. They were not selected because they are genuinely compatible, genuinely interesting to the narcissist at depth, or genuinely capable of the kind of deep knowing that the narcissist, somewhere in the unnamed grief of stage 4, is quietly aware they had and lost with you. The new relationship produces supply, but it does not produce sustenance. It fills the immediate gap, but not the deeper one. The narcissist, moving through stage 4 in the only way available to them, acts restlessly and irritably without the vocabulary to explain what is wrong. They start treating the new person with a version of the same devaluation that eventually ended every previous relationship. They do this because the new person cannot fix the underlying problem, and the narcissist's psychology does not allow them to identify that problem accurately. So the frustration of the unfixable problem lands heavily on the nearest available target. This is the cycle perpetuating itself. This is the pattern that has been running largely unchanged across every significant relationship the narcissist has ever had. But stage 4 has a quality that previous iterations of this cycle did not carry. The ghost of the empath, or simply the person who saw them clearly, moves through the background of their mind. This makes the new relationship feel thinner than it should, makes the supply feel less sustaining than it used to, and makes the performance feel slightly more effortful than it has ever felt before. Stage 5 begins when the narcissist decides to do something about that ghost. What they decide to do is always some version of the exact same action. They attempt to reestablish contact, though not always directly. Sometimes it happens through a mutual friend who has been maintained as an intelligence source since stage 2. Sometimes it happens through a social media interaction so precisely calibrated to seem accidental that the calculation behind it is visible to anyone paying close attention. Sometimes it happens through a direct message that is crafted to seem spontaneous and vulnerable, while actually being a very deliberate probe. They are testing whether the door is still open, whether the supply source is still accessible, and whether the clarity you left with has softened with time into something they can manipulate and work with. This is the hoovering that was born in stage 2, finally being acted on. It was delayed until the rage of stage 3 burned through, and until the unnamed grief of stage 4 created enough internal pressure to override the pride that was preventing action. The version of themselves that the narcissist presents in this re-entry attempt is almost always the stage 1 version of the relationship. It is the version that was warm, attentive, and extraordinarily good at making you feel chosen and understood. The love bombing is reactivated. The charm that worked the first time is deployed with the same precision and the same apparent sincerity. To the narcissist in this moment, it does carry a version of sincerity. They genuinely want the supply back. They genuinely feel the absence of what you provided. That genuine wanting produces a performance of vulnerability that is almost indistinguishable from the real thing. This is especially challenging for someone who loved them, who knows how good it felt when it was good, who has been doing the hard and lonely work of building a life without them, and who is perhaps not entirely impervious to a reminder of what existed before everything went wrong. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire sequence for the person on the receiving end. It is not necessarily because the narcissist is being consciously malicious, though the impact is the exact same regardless of the intention behind it. It is because the re-entry of stage 5 is designed, consciously or not, to find and exploit the exact gap between your healing and your longing. It targets the gap between who you are becoming and who you were when you were with them. It exploits the gap between the clarity you built in your distance from them and the nervous system memory of the connection that existed before the harmful pattern fully revealed itself.